My name is Olivia Bennett. I'm 26 years old, and I never expected to see my parents again after they abandoned me when I was 9. For 17 years, my grandmother Eleanor became my whole world, raising me with more love than my parents ever showed. When cancer took her last month, I thought my grief couldn't get worse until I spotted them walking into her funeral, looking like they hadn't aged a day. They hadn't come for me, they'd come for her $38 million. What they didn't expect was the way Grandma's lawyer started laughing when they demanded their share. Before I tell you what happened next, let me know where you're watching from in the comments, hit that subscribe button, and stay tuned for a story about betrayal, justice, and what family really means. My early childhood in our waterfront Connecticut home seemed perfect from the outside, the kind of privileged upbringing most would envy, with family vacations to Martha's Vineyard, private school education, and a sprawling colonial house overlooking Long Island Sound, where my grandmother Eleanor lived in the guest cottage nearby. My father Jeffrey worked 60-hour weeks at his Manhattan investment firm, climbing the corporate ladder aggressively, while my mother Meredith threw elaborate dinner parties, volunteered selectively for the most prestigious charities, and spent afternoons at exclusive country clubs with women just like her. I remember how my mother's jewelry collection grew with each passing year, how my father's cars became more expensive, and how their arguments about money grew louder despite the increasing luxury surrounding us. I was too young to understand what the 2008 financial crisis really meant, but I felt its tremors in our household as my father's late-night phone calls became more frantic, and my mother's shopping bags fewer. The tension thickened until one ordinary Tuesday evening when I came downstairs for dinner to find suitcases in the foyer instead of the usual place settings in our dining room. "Olivia," my father said without making eye contact, his voice businesslike as if addressing one of his employees. "Your mother and I have an opportunity in Europe that we simply can't pass up." My mother stood beside him, already wearing her travel coat, more focused on her reflection in the hall mirror than on her daughter's confused expression. With clinical precision, they explained they were starting fresh in Switzerland, connecting with important business partners who could restore their financial position. When I asked when we were leaving, the silence stretched uncomfortably before my mother laughed, a brittle sound lacking any warmth. "Darling, we can't possibly afford to take you with us right now. It's just not practical with the new lifestyle adjustments." They spoke of me as if I were an expensive appliance they couldn't fit in their moving truck rather than their child. I remember my father checking his watch repeatedly, explaining that grandmother Eleanor would take good care of me until they got settled, a settlement that never came. My grandmother appeared from the kitchen where she'd been listening, her face pale with shock, but her voice steady as she gathered me against her side. "You cannot be serious, Jeffrey," she said to my father, her only son, while I pressed my face against her cardigan that smelled of vanilla and safety. My parents didn't hug me goodbye. My father patted my head awkwardly while my mother kissed, the air near my cheek careful not to smudge her lipstick. They wheeled their matching designer luggage out the front door as my grandmother held me tightly. And just like that, they vanished from my life. No phone calls came in the following days. No letters arrived in the weeks that followed. No emails appeared to check how I was doing. My 9th birthday came and went without a card, then my 10th, 11th, and every birthday after. Each Christmas I'd check under the tree, hoping for some small acknowledgement of my existence. But nothing ever came. My grandmother never spoke, ill of them in my presence. But the tight line of her mouth whenever I asked when they might return told me everything I needed to know. At night, I'd create elaborate fantasies about why they hadn't contacted me. Perhaps they'd been in a terrible accident and lost their memories, or maybe they were working undercover for the government on a top-secret mission. The alternative, that they simply didn't want me, was too painful for my young mind to process. So I constructed these protective illusions while secretly believing I had done something terribly wrong to make them leave. Within a week of my parents' departure, grandmother Eleanor moved me from our empty family home into her charming seaside cottage with its wraparound porch and rooms filled with books instead of my mother's precious antiques. At first, everything felt temporary. I kept my suitcase packed for months, Convinced my parents would call any day to bring me to their glamorous new European life. Eleanor never pushed me to unpack, simply creating a space that could become mine whenever I was ready. My grandmother wasn't wealthy in the ostentatious way my parents had been. Her home was modest but warm, filled with treasures from her years as a literature professor and her travels studying folklore across continents. She had retired from teaching at Yale just before my parents left, timing that later seemed divinely orchestrated to ensure she could focus entirely on raising her suddenly motherless granddaughter. Unlike my mother's rigidly scheduled parenting style, Eleanor created gentle routines that provided security without constraint. Sunday morning walks along the beach, collecting sea glass, Wednesday afternoon baking sessions where my childish, culinary disasters were celebrated as enthusiastically as my successes, and nightly reading rituals where classics came alive through her expressive voice. Real wealth, she would tell me while we sorted her sea glass collection by color and texture, isn't counted in bank balances, but in relationships that sustain you and principles that guide you. Those words meant little to me at 9, but they became my foundation as I grew. When the other children at school asked about my parents, Eleanor helped me craft honest but dignified responses. When Mother's Day projects in elementary school brought inevitable tears, she sat with me through the pain rather than dismissing it. Through Eleanor, I met the extended support network that would become my surrogate family. Mrs. Jenkins, her attorney who brought her granddaughter Alice to play with me. Dr. Williams, the kind family physician who checked in on us with baskets of fresh vegetables from his garden, and Mr. Richardson, the bow-tie-wearing lawyer who managed my grandmother's affairs and always brought me puzzles to solve during his visits. Trust came slowly after such profound abandonment. For nearly a year, I'd wake panicking in the night, certain Eleanor too would disappear. She never scolded me when I'd appear at her bedside at 3 a.m, simply scooting over to make room, assuring me in the darkness that she wasn't going anywhere. By middle school, the raw wound of my parents' abandonment had formed protective scar tissue. I stopped checking the mailbox for postcards from Switzerland and stopped imagining I'd see them waiting at school pickup. College applications brought the practical challenges of explaining my unusual family situation, but by then, I'd grown accustomed to the sympathetic looks my story elicited. I chose to study education at a university just an hour from home, wanting to become the kind of teacher who might notice the quiet suffering of children like me. Throughout my college years, Eleanor and I grew even closer as our relationship evolved from caregiver and child to something resembling best friends. We never explicitly discussed her financial situation, though I gathered she was comfortable from her generous support of local charities and the fact that she insisted on paying my college tuition outright. Education is an investment no one can take from you, she would say with pointed emphasis that I only later understood referenced my parents' abandonment. Then came the diagnosis 2 years ago, pancreatic cancer, already advanced when discovered. I immediately took a leave of absence from my teaching position at the local elementary school, moving back into my childhood bedroom to care for the woman who had saved me from institutional foster care and a lifetime of wondering why I hadn't been enough for my own parents to stay. Cancer transformed my vibrant, independent grandmother into someone physically diminished but spiritually more powerful than I'd ever known her to be. Eleanor approached dying with the same thoughtful intentionality with which she'd approached living, using her remaining months to complete what she called her unfinished business. Most days found us in the sunroom she loved, Eleanor in her recliner wrapped in handmade quilts despite the summer heat, her once robust frame now barely creating a ripple beneath the fabric. I'd read to her from her favorite poets, or simply sit beside her, both of us watching the rhythmic motion of the ocean visible through wide windows. Forgiveness and justice aren't mutually exclusive, Olivia, she told me one afternoon, seemingly out of nowhere. Sometimes the most compassionate thing is holding someone accountable. I assumed she was sharing general wisdom until she continued. More specifically, I've spent years setting things right, making sure actions have their proper consequences. Before I could question her meaning, we were interrupted by the arrival of Mr. Richardson, her attorney, carrying his weathered leather briefcase and the serious expression he'd worn with increasing frequency during his now weekly visits. Their Conversations would shift to whispers when I left to prepare Eleanor's medications, and I'd return to find spreadsheets and legal documents hastily tucked away. Just boring legal matters Eleanor would dismiss with a wave of her increasingly translucent hand, changing the subject to ask about my former students or neighborhood gossip. Other visitors became regular fixtures as her condition worsened. Financial advisors with specialized portfolios, a notary who came multiple times, and once even a private investigator whose profession I only discovered when I accidentally opened his misplaced business card left on our entry table. Through it all, Eleanor remained mysteriously focused on something beyond her illness, often pausing mid-conversation to make cryptic notes or asking me to help her retrieve specific documents from her study. "I'm setting my affairs in order," was her only explanation, making sure everything goes exactly where it should. During her final weeks, when hospice nurses began their gentle rotation through our home, Eleanor seemed to reach a state of unusual serenity. "I've done everything I needed to do," she told me one evening as I adjusted her pillows. "Now I can go peacefully." The night before she died, during a rare moment of physical comfort granted by her medication schedule, she held my hand with surprising strength. "Promise me you'll stay true to yourself when things get confusing," she whispered. "Remember that your worth has never been tied to dollar amounts." I promised without understanding, thinking her mind was wandering from the morphine. She smiled knowingly and added, "There will be a storm, but you were always stronger than they knew." She drifted to sleep after that, and I crawled carefully beside her on the hospital bed we'd installed in the sunroom, falling asleep to the sound of her increasingly labored breathing and the distant rhythm of waves. When I woke at dawn, her hand was still in mine, but the rise and fall of her chest had ceased. The hospice nurse confirmed what I already knew. Eleanor Bennett, the woman who had chosen to be my mother when my own had failed, was gone. Sitting beside her peaceful form as sunrise illuminated her face, I was overwhelmed by the sudden, suffocating awareness that I was truly alone in the world, adrift without the anchor who had saved me once before. Eleanor had left detailed instructions for her funeral service, nothing ostentatious but dignified, to be held at the historic Trinity Episcopal Church, where generations of our coastal community had marked life's passages beneath its soaring wooden beams and stained glass windows depicting maritime scenes. The church stood just across from the harbor, where fishing boats bobbed beside leisure crafts, a fitting location for a woman who had loved the constancy of the sea. The 3 days between her death and the funeral passed in a blur of arrangements, casseroles delivered by neighbors, and the peculiar administrative tasks that follow a death. Mr. Richardson handled most of the legal details, instructing me to focus on just getting through each day. The memorial service drew a larger crowd than I anticipated. Former students coming from as far as California, colleagues from her university days now stooped with age themselves, and dozens of community members whose lives she had touched in ways I was only beginning to discover. I stood shakily in the church vestibule greeting mourners, accepting condolences from people who had known my grandmother far longer than my 26 years, when a commotion at the entrance caught everyone's attention mid-service. 2 figures appeared in the doorway, backlit dramatically by the bright September sunshine, pausing for effect before making their way down the center aisle, as if arriving fashionably late to a gala rather than a funeral service. It took several seconds for my brain to reconcile the impossibility of what my eyes were seeing. My parents, Jeffrey and Meredith Bennett, sliding into a pew near the front of the church, as the minister paused his eulogy to acknowledge the late arrivals. 17 years had transformed them in ways both expected and surprising. My father's once dark hair was now silver at the temples, lending him an air of distinguished authority, while my mother's face had the taut, expressionless quality that comes from expensive cosmetic procedures. Both wore impeccably tailored black clothing that managed to convey both appropriate mourning and unmistakable luxury. My legs nearly buckled beneath me, prompting Alice, my childhood friend and Mrs. Jenkins's granddaughter, to grip my elbow supportively. "Bathroom," I whispered, fleeing down the side aisle as the minister resumed speaking. In the small church lavatory, I splashed cold water on my face while Alice stood guard at the door, her expression mirroring my shock. "What are they doing?" "Here," she hissed protectively. "They haven't contacted you once in 17 years, and now they show up at Eleanor's funeral?" I had no answer, only the violent churning of my stomach and the sudden, overwhelming sense that Eleanor had somehow anticipated this very scenario. Composing myself enough to return for the conclusion of the service, I deliberately avoided looking toward the front pews where I could feel my parents' presence like an electrical current. The graveside service that followed was mercifully brief, though the sunshine felt like an insult to the darkness swirling inside me. As mourners dispersed toward their cars following the final prayer, my parents materialized before me with practiced social smiles that never reached their eyes. "Olivia, darling," my mother crooned, as if we'd seen each other just last weekend, instead of nearly 2 decades ago. "You've grown into such a lovely young woman." My father extended his hand formally, as if greeting a business associate. "A terrible loss," he said, gesturing vaguely toward the casket being lowered into the ground. "Mother always was the strong one in the family." The casual presumption of continued family connection made my blood simmer beneath my skin. Before I could formulate a response beyond stunned silence, my mother leaned closer with synthetic sympathy. "We should discuss the estate, of course. Your grandmother was quite comfortable, as I recall." The naked avarice beneath her performance of grief answered my unspoken question about their sudden reappearance. They hadn't come for me. They had come for whatever they believed they could claim from Eleanor's estate. Mr. Richardson appeared. At my elbow, his bow tie slightly askew, but his voice perfectly measured. "The reading of the will is scheduled for 4 o'clock at the Bennett residence," he announced, addressing the small group of essential family and close friends still lingering. Mrs. Bennett was very specific about who should be present. My parents exchanged barely concealed triumphant glances at the mention of the Bennett residence, a property they clearly still considered connected to their name despite abandoning it years ago. As we walked toward our respective cars, I noticed Mr. Richardson's knowing glances my way, his expression unreadable but somehow reassuring. My parents followed the funeral procession back to the house I'd shared with Eleanor, commenting loudly on how little has changed and what valuable property this has always been. With each presumptuous remark, my shock gradually transformed into a simmering anger I struggled to contain. By the time we gathered in Eleanor's wood-paneled library for the reading of the will, I felt simultaneously numb with grief and electrified with rage, wondering what final lessons my grandmother had left for me to learn. Eleanor's library had always been my favorite room in our home, walls lined with carefully curated books, the antique desk where she'd graded papers for decades, and the worn leather chairs that had hosted countless reading sessions throughout my childhood. Now it felt like a stage set for some bizarre theater production, as Mr. Richardson arranged his documents at the desk while my parents inspected the room's contents with poorly disguised assessment of their potential value. Alice sat protectively close beside me on the window seat, while Dr. Williams and Mrs. Jenkins occupied the armchairs nearest the unlit fireplace. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked with unusual loudness in the tense silence until my father cleared his throat impatiently. "Let's get on with it, shall we?" he prompted, checking his Swiss watch. "We have a flight back to Geneva tomorrow afternoon." Mr. Richardson adjusted his bow tie deliberately, the picture of unhurried professionalism. "Before we begin, I should explain that Mrs. Bennett left very specific instructions about how this proceeding should unfold." My mother waved a manicured hand dismissively. Yes, legal formalities. We understand. But perhaps you could start with the significant assets and distributions?" Her emphasis on significant made her priorities unmistakable. "Mr. Richardson's?" Expression remained impassive as he removed his reading glasses from his breast pocket and placed them carefully on his nose. "As executor of Mrs. Eleanor Bennett's estate, I am legally obligated to inform all parties that the total value of her assets at the time of her death amounted to approximately $38.7 million. The figure hung in the air like a physical presence. My mother gasped audibly while my father leaned forward in his chair, abandoning all pretense of mourning. My own shock must have registered visibly because Alice squeezed my hand in support. I had known my grandmother was comfortable, but never imagined she possessed such wealth. She had lived so modestly, driving the same car for 20 years and darning holes in her cardigans rather than replacing them. "Well," my father said, his voice shifting to the smooth tone I vaguely remembered from his business calls. Mother always was prudent with her investments. My mother was less subtle, already mentally spending her anticipated windfall. "The Swiss chalet will need updating, of course, and I've had my eye on property in the Maldives." Mr. Richardson cleared his throat pointedly. Before discussing distributions, Mrs. Bennet left a personal message to be read aloud to the family. He lifted a sealed envelope with Eleanor's distinctive handwriting visible on the front. As he broke the seal and unfolded the letter inside, my parents shifted impatiently while I braced myself for my grandmother's final words. "To those gathered in my library today," Mr. Richardson read in his measured baritone, "if you are hearing this, then, I have completed my journey and moved beyond the concerns of this world. Before Mr. Richardson executes my final wishes regarding my estate, there are truths that must be acknowledged after 17 years of silence." My parents exchanged uneasy glances as Mr. Richardson continued reading my grandmother's words. When my son Jeffrey and his wife Meredith left for Europe in 2008, abandoning their 9-year-old daughter to my care, they offered financial hardship as their explanation. What they did not disclose was the nature of that hardship nor its true cause. Mr. Richardson paused, looking directly at my father. Jeffrey and Meredith Bennet did not leave the country due to the financial crisis. They fled to avoid prosecution after embezzling $4.3 million from my personal accounts and investment portfolio. The accusation exploded in the quiet room. My father half rose from his chair, face flushing. "This is outrageous. We would never—" Mr. Richardson silenced him by producing a thick folder. Mrs. Bennet spent 17 years building this case file with forensic accountants and private investigators. The evidence is irrefutable and has already been submitted to the relevant authorities. My mother's artificially smooth forehead somehow managed to contort with panic. "You can't possibly prove anything after all this time," she hissed. Mr. Richardson continued as if she hadn't spoken. "Eleanor discovered the theft shortly after you left, when several investments matured, and the funds were missing. The money had been siphoned gradually over 3 years through a sophisticated scheme of forged authorizations and fraudulent accounts." As the reality of my grandmother's words sank in, fragments of memories rearranged themselves in my mind. My parents' increasingly lavish lifestyle, despite my father's complaints about market downturns, the hushed arguments I'd overheard as a child, and most devastatingly, the real reason they couldn't afford to take me with them. They hadn't abandoned me because of financial hardship. They had abandoned me to escape the consequences of stealing from the very woman who then raised me. Mr. Richardson placed the letter down momentarily to address my parents directly. "Mrs. Bennet wished me to inform you that your return today was not coincidental. The notice of her passing was deliberately leaked to financial circles in Switzerland through her investigators, along with misleading information about her estate, planning specifically to test whether you would resurface after all these years." My father's face had transformed from indignation to the ashen pallor of someone watching their freedom dissolve before their eyes. "You can't be serious," he whispered, but the authority had drained from his voice. My mother's survival instincts kicked in more quickly. "Whatever Eleanor thought happened was clearly a misunderstanding," she insisted, turning to me with manufactured maternal concern. "Olivia, darling, surely you don't believe these absurd accusations against your parents? After all we've sacrificed." Her performance was interrupted by 3 sharp knocks on the library door. Mr. Richardson nodded as if on cue, and 2 uniformed police officers entered, accompanied by a woman in a dark suit who immediately presented credentials identifying her as a federal agent specializing in financial crimes. "Jeffrey and Meredith Bennet?" she inquired formally. "I have warrants for your arrest on multiple charges including grand theft, wire fraud, identity theft, and tax evasion." My parents' transformation was immediate and disturbing. My father, attempting to bluster his way out with threats about his connections, while my mother dissolved into theatrical sobs about being persecuted. They looked desperately around the room for allies or escape routes, finally settling their gazes on me. "Olivia," my father pleaded, "you can't let them do this. We're your parents." In that moment, looking at these strangers who shared my DNA, but nothing of my life, I finally understood Eleanor's cryptic comments about forgiveness and justice existing simultaneously. As the officers placed handcuffs on my parents' wrists, reading them their rights with procedural calmness, Mr. Richardson's unexpected reaction broke the tension in the room. He laughed. It wasn't a cruel laugh or even a triumphant one, but rather the satisfied chuckle of someone witnessing the completion of a masterfully executed long-term plan. My mother's mascara-streaked face contorted with indignation at his response. "How dare you!" she shrieked as the female agent guided her toward the door. "Do you have any idea who we are?" This only prompted another measured laugh from the attorney, who removed his glasses and polished them calmly before responding. "I know exactly who you are, Mrs. Bennett. I've spent 17 years helping Eleanor document precisely who you are." My father attempted a different strategy, his voice dropping to the reasonable businessman tone I vaguely remembered from childhood. "Richardson, surely we can come to some arrangement. Whatever Eleanor's left, we could split it reasonably. Certainly more beneficial than pursuing ancient history through the courts." Mr. Richardson's smile faded as he stepped closer to my father. "There is no arrangement to be made, Jeffrey. Your mother gave you every opportunity to make amends over the years. She tracked you through 6 countries. She sent registered letters to every address you occupied. She even attempted to visit you in Geneva 5 years ago, only to have you flee to Monaco when you discovered she was coming." This new information hit me like physical blows. Eleanor had never told me about any of these attempts to contact my parents. All those business trips she had taken during my college years suddenly made sense in this new context. The federal agent nodded to her colleagues to continue the removal process, prompting my mother to make one last desperate appeal in my direction. "Olivia, stop them! Tell them this is all a mistake. We're still your family." She twisted against, her restraints, her designer outfit now rumpled and her carefully constructed facade crumbling. I stood frozen, 17 years of abandoned birthdays and empty mailboxes flashing through my mind, until Alice squeezed my hand supportively. "My family was right here all along," I finally responded, my voice steadier than I expected. "My grandmother was my family. These people beside me are my family. You gave up the right to that word a long time ago." I watched with complex emotions as my parents were escorted from Eleanor's house, our house, protesting their innocence to the indifferent trees lining the driveway. When the sounds of police vehicles faded, Mr. Richardson gently suggested that the remaining guests take refreshments in the kitchen, leaving him alone with me in the library to continue our business. Once the door closed behind them, he returned to Eleanor's letter with renewed solemnity. "There is, of course, significantly more to your grandmother's will than the justice you just witnessed," he explained, his tone softening. "If you feel ready to continue." I nodded numbly, still processing the revelation that my childhood abandonment had been even more calculated than I'd understood. Mr. Richardson adjusted his bow tie and resumed reading Eleanor's carefully crafted words. "With matters of justice addressed, I now turn to matters of legacy. My estate of $38 million represents not simply careful investment, but a life dedicated to purpose. While society often measures worth in dollar amounts, I have measured mine in positive impact." What followed stunned me further. Detailed instructions for the establishment of the Eleanor Bennett Education Foundation, a charitable organization dedicated to supporting children who had experienced abandonment or family trauma. The majority of her fortune would fund scholarships, counseling services, and educational programs specifically designed for young people whose family circumstances mirrored my own. "To my beloved granddaughter Olivia," the letter continued, causing my throat to tighten with emotion, "I leave a trust of $3 million for your security and happiness, with the hope that you will serve on the foundation's board and Help implement its mission with the compassion that adversity has taught you. The distribution continued with smaller bequests to Alice, Dr. Williams, and Mrs. Jenkins, the surrogate family who had supported us both. But the majority would serve Eleanor's vision of transforming childhood trauma into educational opportunity. As the formal reading concluded, Mr. Richardson presented me with a separate envelope. "Your grandmother asked that you receive this privately," he explained, respectfully stepping toward the door to give me space. The envelope contained a handwritten letter on Eleanor's personal stationery, her familiar script slightly shakier than I remembered from my childhood lunch notes and birthday cards. "My dearest Olivia," it began, "if you're reading this, then you've witnessed the resolution of a situation I've worked toward for many years. Please understand that I never told you about your parents' theft or my attempts to contact them because I didn't want your healing burdened by additional betrayal. The truth about your abandonment was painful enough without knowing its full selfishness." Tears blurred my vision as I continued reading her explanation of how she'd tracked my parents across Europe, documenting their fraudulent activities while simultaneously building the fortune they assumed they would eventually inherit. "Justice was necessary," she wrote, "but revenge was never my purpose. I needed accountability for their actions. Yes, but more importantly, I needed to ensure they could never hurt you again." The final paragraphs detailed the countless lives Eleanor had quietly improved through anonymous scholarships and community support throughout her life. Names I recognized from town: the bakery owner's daughter, who mysteriously received full medical school funding, the fisherman's sons who attended trade school during hard seasons, and dozens more who had benefited from Eleanor's silent generosity. "My true wealth was never in my bank accounts," her letter concluded, "but in the privilege of raising you and watching you become the compassionate teacher who notices the quiet pain in children's eyes because you remember how that pain feels. The money is just a tool. Use it to build the world you wish had existed when you were 9 years old, and trying to understand why you weren't enough for them to stay." I pressed the letter to my chest, feeling connected to Eleanor even in her absence, finally understanding that she had planned not just for justice, but for healing all along. 6 months after the dramatic events of Eleanor's funeral, springtime brought new growth to the garden she had loved tending. The seaside cottage remained my home, though I now shared the space with manuscripts and planning documents rather than medical equipment and hospice supplies. The formal launch of the Eleanor Bennett Education Foundation was scheduled for the following month, transformed from abstract legal language into living purpose through countless hours of collaboration with educators, counselors, and child welfare experts. The first scholarships would support 15 children from our county's foster system, providing not just financial assistance, but the comprehensive emotional support I wished I'd had during those early days of abandonment. While my teaching career remained on hiatus, education had become my full-time focus in a different capacity as I worked to implement Eleanor's vision of transformative support for wounded children. My parents' legal situation had resolved with surprising swiftness given the meticulous evidence Eleanor and Mr. Richardson had compiled over 17 years. They accepted a plea agreement rather than face a public trial, receiving reduced sentences in exchange for returning what remained of the stolen assets and cooperating with authorities investigating similar financial crimes within their social circle. Their Swiss chalet and luxury possessions were liquidated to make restitution, though the emotional damage they had caused could never be so neatly reconciled. 3 weeks after their sentencing, I made the difficult decision to visit my father at the minimum security facility where he would spend the next 4 years. Our meeting in the sterile visitation room bore little resemblance to the tearful reunions depicted in movies. No dramatic confrontations or cathartic forgiveness scenes, just awkward silence punctuated by his clumsy attempts at justification. "We always intended to send for you," he claimed without meeting my eyes, the silver in his hair more pronounced under the harsh institutional lighting. "Things just got complicated." I studied this stranger across the table, searching for any glimpse of the father who had once pushed me on park swings and taught me to ride a bicycle. Finding nothing familiar in his calculating gaze, I realized the visit wasn't for reconciliation, but for my own closure. I didn't need to hate him or forgive him. I simply needed to acknowledge the reality of who he was and move beyond the fantasy. Child's hope that he might someday become someone different. "I'm not here to understand why you left," I told him before standing to signal the end of our visit. "I'm here to tell you that I stopped waiting for you to come back." I didn't visit my mother at her separate facility, having gained all the closure I needed from that single conversation. The foundation work provided healthier focus than dwelling on past betrayals, each scholarship recipient representing a chance to transform abandonment's legacy into something constructive. Alice joined the foundation as our community outreach coordinator, bringing her social work expertise to our growing team. Mrs. Jenkins offered her retired accountant's skills to help manage the endowment, while Dr. Williams provided medical consultations for scholarship recipients with limited healthcare access. The community Eleanor had cultivated around us became the foundation's core strength, demonstrating that family connections transcend biological relationships. I purchased a small cottage walking distance from Eleanor's house, restoring its weather-worn exterior while preserving its historical character, a physical manifestation of my own healing journey. The foundation occupied Eleanor's former home, transforming the sunroom where she had spent her final days into a bright meeting space where children with backgrounds similar to mine could find mentorship and support. On Sunday mornings, I maintained our tradition of beach walks, collecting sea glass in the small pouch Eleanor had sewn for me as a child, occasionally inviting foundation scholarship recipients to join me in the ritual that had once helped steady my own wounded heart. During one such morning walk, I encountered Michael Richardson following the same shoreline path, with his golden retriever bounding through shallow waves. The attorney's son had recently returned to town to join his father's practice after years working in Boston, and our paths increasingly crossed through foundation business. We shared coffee at the beachside cafe that morning, conversation flowing easily between foundation matters and personal stories, his father's bow tie preference apparently genetic based on Michael's own Natalie-tied accessory. What began as occasional volunteer collaboration gradually evolved into regular dinner discussions about childhood development theories and eventually weekend hikes where professional boundaries softened into something more personal. Unlike my carefully compartmentalized relationships with previous boyfriends, I found myself sharing the complex truth of my background with Michael from the beginning, his legal understanding of my parents' crimes providing unexpected common ground rather than awkward explanation. With the foundation established and my personal life finding new balance, I visited Eleanor's memorial bench overlooking the harbor on the anniversary of her passing, the bronze plaque bearing her name. Caught afternoon sunlight as I arranged fresh wildflowers beside it, the type she had always preferred over formal bouquets. "You were right about wealth having nothing to do with bank accounts," I whispered, imagining her sitting beside me as we had countless times before. The real inheritance was learning how to build family from chosen connections and purpose from personal pain. A gentle breeze carried the scent of salt and possibility as I considered how drastically life had changed in a single year. From caregiver to foundation director, from abandoned daughter to architect of support for others similarly wounded. Eleanor's final gift hadn't been financial security, but the freedom to define family and legacy on my own terms, something my biological parents had never understood despite their relentless pursuit of wealth. As the sun began its descent towards the horizon, I reflected on how many wounded children might find healing through the resources Eleanor had marshaled during her quiet 17-year campaign for justice. Have you ever discovered that someone's betrayal actually led you to your true path in life? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below about how you've transformed difficult experiences into something meaningful. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe to hear more journeys of healing and justice, and share with someone who might need to know they're not alone in rebuilding after abandonment. Thank you for witnessing my story today. May you find family in those who choose to stay, not those who share your name, but abandon their responsibilities. Like and subscribe for more stories of unexpected strength found in life's most challenging moments.